Chapter 20 of Elsie's Girlhood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elida Blair. Elsie's Girlhood by Martha Finley. Chapter 20. She is not sad, yet in her gaze appears something that makes the gazer think of tears. Mrs. Embury. The family at Roselands were gathered about the breakfast table, a much smaller party than of yore, since Horace had taken Elsie and set up an establishment of his own, and the other sons were away at college and 2 daughters married, leaving only Mr. and Mrs. Dinsmore, Adelaide, and Enna to occupy the old home. "I presume you have the lion's share as usual, papa," observed the last named, as her father opened the letter bag which Pomp had just brought in. "And who has a better right, Miss Malapert?" retorted the old gentleman. "Yes, here are several letters for me, but as there is one apiece for the rest of you, nobody need complain. Here, Pomp, hand this to your mistress. From Walter, I see." "Yes," she answered, opening it, "and a few lines from Arthur, too. I'm glad he's able to write again, poor fellow." "Yes," said Adelaide. "Rose says Horace has been up there and found him nearly recovered. She writes that they are coming home." "When?" asked Enna. "Why, today. The letter has been delayed," said her sister, looking at the date. "I shall ride over directly to see that all is in order for them at the Oaks." "There is no need," remarked her mother. "Rose will have written to Mrs. Murray." "I presume so. Still I shall go. It will be pleasant to be there to welcome them when they arrive." "How fond you are of Rose," said Mrs. Dinsmore in a piqued tone. "You wouldn't do more for one of your own sisters, I believe, than for her." "I wouldn't do less, mamma, and I am very fond of her. We are so perfectly congenial." "And Elsie's a great pet of yours, too," said Enna sneeringly. "Well, I shall put off my call till tomorrow, when the trunks will have been unpacked, and I shall have a chance to see the fashions. Elsie will have loads of new things. It's perfectly absurd the way Horace always heaps presents upon her, and pocket money too. Such loads of jewelry as she has, 2 or 3 gold watches, and everything else in proportion." "He may as well. She can never spend the half of her income," remarked Mr. Dinsmore, "unless she takes to gambling," he added in a tone that seemed to say that his purse had suffered severely from someone's indulgence in that vice. Mrs. Dinsmore winced. Emma looked vexed and annoyed, and Adelaide sad and troubled. But when she spoke, it was in answer to Enna. "Yes, Elsie will have a great many beautiful things to show us, of course, but though she wears nothing outré, she has never been, and I think never will be, a mirror of fashion. It would suit neither her own taste nor Horace's. And you know, fond of her as he is, he will never allow her to have a will of her own in dress or anything else. So it is well their tastes harmonize." "I wouldn't be his child for all her money," said Enna. "There would be some fighting if you were," said her father, laughing. "I never could tell whether he tyrannized over Rose in the same style or not," observed Mrs. Dinsmore interrogatively. "All I know about is that they seem perfectly happy in each other," answered Adelaide. "But I don't suppose Horace considers a husband's authority by any means equal to a father's." Something delayed Adelaide, and it was nearly 2 hours after they rose from the table ere she was fairly on her way to the Oaks. "Why, they are here before me!" she exclaimed half aloud as she came in sight of the house. There were piles of luggage upon the veranda, and the whole family, including all the house servants, were gathered round a large open trunk from which Mrs. Dinsmore and Elsie were dealing out gifts, dresses, aprons, bonnets, hats, gay handkerchiefs, etc., etc., the darkies receiving them with a delight that was pleasant to see. Mr. Dinsmore, too, was taking his part in the distribution, and as Adelaide rode up, little Horace was in the act of throwing a gay shawl about the shoulders of his nurse, who caught him in her arms and hugged and kissed him over and over, calling him honey and pet, and you old mammy's darling old child. So much engaged were they all that no one perceived Adelaide's approach till she had reined in her horse close to the veranda, and throwing her bridle to her attendant, sprung lightly to the ground. But then there was a shout of welcome from little Horace, followed instantly by joyous exclamations and embraces from the others. "Dear me, what a long stay you made of it!" said Adelaide. "You can have no idea how I missed you all, even down to this little man," patting Horace's rosy cheek. "You look remarkably well, Rose, and the two Horaces also. But Elsie, I think, has grown a little pale, thin and heavy-eyed. What ails you, child? Pining for your native air? No, home air, I presume. Is that it?" "Hardly pining for it, auntie, but very glad to get back nevertheless," Elsie answered with a blush and a smile. "And you are not pale now, but don't let me interrupt your pleasant employment. I wish I had been in time to see the whole of it." "You are unseasoned for your own gifts. Will you accept a trifle from me?" said her brother, putting a jewel case into her hand. "Coral! And what a beautiful shade!" she cried. "Thank you, they are just what I wanted." "I thought they would contrast prettily with this, auntie," said Elsie, laying a dress pattern of black silk upon her lap. "And these are to be worn at the same time, if it so pleases you," added Rose, presenting her with collar and undersleeves of point lace. "Oh, Rose, how lovely! And even little Horace bringing auntie a gift," as the child slipped something into her hand. "It's only a card case, but mamma said you'd like it, Aunt Addie." "And I do; it's very pretty. And here's a hug and a kiss for the pet boy that remembered his old maid auntie." "Old maid, indeed! Adelaide, I'll not have you talking so," said Rose. "There's nothing old maidish about you, not even age yet. A girl of 26 to be calling herself that! It's perfectly absurd. Isn't it, my dear?" "I think so, indeed," replied Mr. Dinsmore. "Here, Jim, Cato, and the rest of you, carry in these trunks and boxes, and let us have them unpacked and put out of sight." "Oh yes," said Adelaide, "I want to see all the fine things you have brought, Rose. Mamma, Enna, and I are depending upon you and Elsie for the fashions." "Yes, we had all our fall and winter dresses made up in Philadelphia. We prefer their styles to the New York. They don't go to such extremes, you know; and besides, hailing from the Quaker city as I do, it's natural I should be partial to her plainer ways. But we brought quantities of patterns from both places, knowing that nothing was likely to be too gay for Enna. We will let Elsie display hers first. I feel in a special hurry, dear, to show your aunt these elegant silks your papa and I helped you to select. I hope you will see them all on her one of these days, Adelaide." "That child's complexion is so perfect that she can wear anything," she said in an aside, as they followed Elsie to her apartments. "There's a pale blue that she looks perfectly lovely in, a pearl color too, and a delicate pink, and I don't know how many more. One might think we expected her to do nothing but attend parties the coming season." Elsie seemed to take a lively interest in displaying her pretty things to her aunt, and looking on for a little, while Rose did the same with hers. But at length, though the two older ladies were still turning over and discussing silks, satins, velvets, laces, ribbons, feathers, and flowers, her father noticed her sitting in the corner of a sofa, in an attitude of weariness and dejection, with a pale cheek, and a dreary, far-off look in her eyes that it pained him to see. "You are very tired, daughter," he said, going to her side, and smoothing her glossy brown hair with tender, caressing motion, as he spoke. "Go and lie down for an hour or two. A nap would do you a great deal of good." "I don't like to do so while Aunt Addie is here, papa. she said, looking up at him with a smile and trying to seem fresh and bright.
Never mind that. You can see her any day now. Come, you must take a rest."
And drawing her hand within his arm, he led her to her boudoir and left her there, comfortably established upon a sofa. "A hat trimmed in that style would be becoming to Elsie," remarked Adelaide, continuing the conversation with Rose, and turning to look at her niece as she spoke. "Why, she's not here." "Papa took her away to make her lie down," said little Horace. "Rose, does anything ail the child?" asked Adelaide in an undertone. "She does not seem to be out of health, but you know we are very careful of her. She is so dear and sweet, and has never looked very strong." "But there is something wrong with her, is there not? She does not seem to be quite the gay, careless child she was when you went away. Horace," and she turned to him as he re-entered the room, "may I not know about Elsie? You can hardly love her very much better than I do, I think."
"If that is so, you must love her very much indeed," he answered with a faint smile. "Yes, I will tell you."
And he explained the matter, briefly at first, then more in detail, as she drew him on by questions and remarks. Her sympathy for Elsie was deep and sincere, yet she thought her brother's course the only wise and kind one, and her indignation waxed hot against Arthur and Egerton. "And Elsie still believes in the scoundrel?" she said inquiringly.
"Yes, her loving, trustful nature refuses to credit the proofs of his guilt, and only her sweet, conscientious submission to parental authority has saved her from becoming his victim."
"She's a very good, submissive, obedient child to you, Horace."
"I could not ask a better, Adelaide. I only wish it were in my power to make obedience always easy and pleasant to her, poor darling."
"I hope you have something for me there, my dear," Rose remarked to her husband at the breakfast table the next morning, as he looked over the mail just brought in by his man John.
"Yes, there is one for you, from your mother, I think. And, Elsie, do you know the handwriting of this?"
"No, papa, it is quite strange to me," she answered, taking the letter he held out to her, and which bore her name and address on the back, and examining it critically.
"And the postmark tells you nothing either?"
"No, sir, I cannot quite make it out, but it doesn't seem to be any place where I have a correspondent."
"Well, open it and see from whom it comes, but finish your breakfast first."
Elsie laid the letter down by her plate, and putting aside, for the present, her curiosity in regard to it, went on with her meal. "From whom can it have come?" she asked herself, while listening half absently to extracts from Mr. Allison's epistle. "Not from him, surely. The hand is so very unlike that of the one he sent me in Lansdale."
"You have not looked at that yet," her father said, seeing her take it up as they rose from the table. "You may do so now. I wish to know who the writer is. Don't read it till you have found that out," he added, leading her to a sofa in the next room, and making her sit down there while he stood by her side.
She felt that his eye was upon her as she broke open the envelope, and, taking the letter from it, glanced down the page, then a little flutter of surprise and perplexity turned to the signature. Instantly her face flushed crimson, she trembled visibly, and her eyes were lifted pleadingly to his. He frowned and held out his hand. "Oh, papa, let me read it," she murmured low and tremulously, her eyes still pleading more eloquently than her tongue.
"No," he said, and his look and gesture were imperative.
She silently put the letter into his hand, and turned away with a low sob.
"It is not worth one tear or even an emotion of regret, my child," he said, sitting down beside her. "I shall send it back at once, unread, unless you prefer to have me read it first."
"No, papa."
"Very well, then, I shall not. But, Elsie, do you not see now that he is quite capable of imitating the handwriting of another?"
"Yes, papa, but that does not prove that he did in the case you refer to."
"And he has acted quite fairly and honesty in using that talent to elude my vigilance and tempt you to deception and disobedience, eh?"
"He is not perfect, papa, but I can't believe him as bad as you think."
There are none so blind as those who won't see, Elsie. But remember," and his tone changed from one of great vexation to another sternly authoritative, "I will be obeyed in this thing."
"Yes, papa," she said, and rising, hastily left the room. "Try to be very patient with her, dear," said Rose, who had been a silent but deeply interested spectator of the little scene. "She suffers enough, poor child."
"Yes, and I know it, and my heart bleeds for her, yet she seems so wilfully blind to the strongest proofs of the fellow's abominable rascality that at times I feel as if I could hardly put up with it at all. The very pain of seeing her suffer so makes me out of all patience with her folly."
"Yes, I understand it, but do not be stern with her. She surely does not deserve it while she is so perfectly submissive to your will."
"No, she does not, poor darling," he said with a sigh. "But I must make haste to write some letters that ought to go by the next mail."
He left the room, and Mrs. Dinsmore, longing to comfort Elsie in her trouble, was about to go in search of her, when Mrs. Murray, who was still housekeeper at the Oaks, came to ask advice or direction about some household matters. The consultation lasted for half an hour or more, and in the meanwhile Mr. Dinsmore finished his correspondence and went himself to look for his daughter. She was in the act of opening her writing desk as he entered the room.
"What are you doing, daughter?"
he asked. "I was about to write a letter to Sophie, papa."
"It would be too late for today's mail, so let it wait, and come with me for a little stroll into the grounds. Aunt Chloe, bring a garden hat and sunshade. You would like to go, daughter?"
"Yes, papa. You are not vexed with me? You don't think I want to be disobedient or wilful?" There were tears in her voice, and traces of them on her cheeks.
"No, darling," he said, drawing her to him, "and you did not in the least deserve to be spoken to in the stern tone that I used. But can you understand it? My very love for you makes me angry and impatient at your persistent love for that scoundrel."
"Papa, please don't," she said in a low, pained tone, and turning away her face.
"Ah, you do not like to hear a word against him," he sighed. "I can't bear to think it, and yet I fear you care more for him than for me, your own father, who almost idolizes you. Is it so?"
"Papa," she murmured, winding her arms about his neck and laying her head on his breast, "if I may have but one of you, I could never hesitate for a moment to choose to cling here where I have been so long and tenderly cherished. I know what your love is. I might be mistaken and deceived in another; and besides, God commands me to honor and obey you." He held her close to his heart for a moment, as something too dear and precious ever to be given up to another. Then, drawing her hand within his arm, while Chloe placed the hat on her head and gave her the parasol, he led her out into the grounds. It pained him to notice the sadness of her countenance, sadder than he had seen it for many days, and he exerted himself to entertain her and divert her thoughts, calling her attention to some new plants and flowers, consulting her taste in regard to improvements he designed making, and conversing with her about a book they had been reading. She understood his thoughtful kindness, was grateful for it, and did her best to be interested and cheerful. "It is so nice to have you treat me as your companion and friend, as well as your daughter, papa," she said, looking up at him with a smile.
"Your companionship is very dear and sweet to me, daughter," he answered. "But I think we had better go in now; the sun is growing hot."
"Oh, here you are!" cried a girlish voice, as they turned into a shaded walk leading to the house. "I've been looking everywhere, and am glad to have found you at last. Really, if a body didn't know your relationship, he or she might almost imagine you a pair of lovers."
"Don't be silly, Enna. How do you do?" said Mr. Dinsmore, shaking hands with her and giving her a brotherly kiss.
"As usual, thank you," she answered, turning away from him to Elsie, whom she embraced with tolerable warmth, saying, I'm really glad to have you here again. I miss you more than I would have believed. Now, come in and show me all your pretty things. I'm dying to see them. Adelaide says you've brought home such quantities of lovely laces, silks, velvets, ribbons, flowers, feathers, and what not, that one might imagine you'd nearly bought out the Philadelphia merchants." "No, they had quite a stock still left," replied Elsie, smiling. "But as mamma says, papa was very indulgent and liberal to us both, and I shall take pleasure in showing you his gifts."
"How do you like my present to Adelaide?" asked Mr. Dinsmore.
"Oh, very much; but when my turn comes, please remember I want amethysts."
"Ah, then I have been very fortunate in my selection," he said, quite unsuspicious of the fact that Enna had instructed Elsie beforehand in regard to her wishes, should Horace intend to making her a present. Elsie had quietly given the desired hint, but merely as though the idea had originated with herself. The jewelry was highly approved, as also a rich violet silk from Rose, and a lace set from Elsie. Adelaide had been entrusted with quite as rich gifts for her father and mother, nor had Laura been forgotten. Elsie had a handsome shawl for her, Mr. Dinsmore a beautiful pair of bracelets, and Rose a costly volume of engravings.
"Do you think Aunt Laura will be pleased?" asked Elsie. "They're splendid. It must be mighty nice to have so much money to spend. But come now, show me what you got for yourselves." She spent a long while, first in Rose's apartment, then in Elsie's, turning over and admiring the pretty things, discussing patterns and styles of trimming, and what colors and modes would be becoming to her, trying on some of the dresses, laces, sacques, shawls, bonnets, and hats, without so much as saying "by your leave," when the article in question belonged to her niece, that she might judge of the effect, several times repeating her remark that it must be delightful to have so much money, and that Elsie was exceedingly fortunate in being so enormously wealthy. "Yes, it is something to be thankful for," Elsie said at length; "but, Enna, it is also a great responsibility. We are only stewards, you know, and sometimes I fear it is hardly right for me to spend so much in personal adornment." "That wouldn't trouble me in the least. But why do you do it if you are afraid it's wrong?" "Papa does not think so. He says the manufacturers of these rich goods must live as well as others, and that for one with my income it is no more extravagant to wear them than for one with half the means to wear goods only half as expensive." "And I'm sure he's perfectly right, and of course you have no choice but to obey. Well, I presume I've seen everything now, and I'm actually weary with my labors," she added, throwing herself into an easy chair. "You've grown a little pale, I think, and your eyes look as if you've been crying. What ails you?" "I am not at all ill," returned Elsie, flushing. "I didn't say you were, but something's wrong with you, and you can't deny it. You don't seem as gay as you used to be before you went away." She paused, but receiving no reply, went on. "Come now, it isn't worth while to be so close-mouthed with me, Miss Dinsmore, for I happen to know pretty much all about it already. You've fallen in love with a man that your father thinks a scamp, and though you don't believe it, you've given him up in obedience to orders, like the cowardly piece that you are. Dear me, before I'd be so afraid of my father." "No, you neither fear nor love your father as I do mine." "But fear of papa has very little to do with it. I love him far too well to refuse to submit to him in this, and I fear God, who bids me obey and honor him. But, Enna, how did you learn all this?" "Ah, that is my secret." Elsie looked disturbed. "Won't you tell me?" "Not I." "Is it generally known in the family?" "So far as I am aware, no one knows it but myself." "Ah," thought Elsie, "I did not believe Aunt Adelaide or Walter would tell her, but I wonder how she did find it out." "I wouldn't give up the man I loved for anybody," Enna went on in a sneering tone. "I say parents have no business to interfere in such matters, so I told papa quite plainly when he took it upon him to lecture me about receiving attentions from Dick Percival, and threatened to forbid him in the house." Oh, Anna, you consider it wickedly disrespectful and rebellious, no doubt, but I say I'm no longer a child, and so the text, "Children, obey your parents," which I know is just on the end of your tongue, doesn't apply to me. The Bible doesn't say obey till you are of age, then do as you please. You are not 17 yet, and Isaac was 20 when he submitted to be bound and laid upon the altar. Well, when I go to the altar, it shall be leaning on Dick's arm, said Anna, laughing. I don't care if he is wild. I like him, and I intend to marry him too. But are you not afraid? Afraid of what? That he will run through his property in a few years, and perhaps become an habitual drunkard and abusive to his wife? I mean to risk it anyhow, returned Anna sharply, so it is not worth while for my friends to waste their breath in lecturing me on the subject. Oh, Anna, you can't expect a blessing if you persist in being so undutiful. I think it would be well for you if your father were more like mine. Indeed, I wouldn't be your father's daughter for anything. And I am glad and thankful that I am. End of chapter 20. Recording by Elida Blair, North Mankato, Minnesota.
Chapter 21 of Elsie's Girlhood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elida Blair. Elsie's Girlhood by Martha Finley. Chapter 21. The human heart, 'tis a thing that lives in the light of many a shrine, and the gem of its own pure feelings gives too oft on brows that are false to shine. It has many a cloud of care and woe to shadow o'er its springs, and the one above alone may know the changing tune of its thousand strings. Mrs. L.P. Smith. Mr. and Mrs. Horace Dinsmore were most anxious to promote Elsie's happiness, and in order to that to win her to forgetfulness of her unworthy suitor. Being Christians, they did not take her to the ballroom, the opera, or the theatre, nor would she have consented to go if they had proposed it. But they provided for her every sort of suitable amusement within their reach. She was allowed to entertain as much company and to pay as many visits to neighbors and friends as she pleased. But a constant round of gaiety was not to her taste. She loved quiet home pleasures and intellectual pursuits far better. And of these also she might take her fill, nor lack for sympathizing companionship, both parents, but especially her father, being of like mind with herself. They enjoyed many a book together, and she chose to pursue several studies with him. And thus the weeks and months glided away, not unhappily, though at times she would be possessed with a restless longing for news from Egerton, and for the love that was denied her. Then her eyes would occasionally meet her father's with the old wistful pleading look that he found so hard to resist. He well understood their mute petition, yet it was one he could not grant. But he would take her in his arms, and giving her the fondest, tenderest caresses, would say in a moved tone, "My darling, don't look at me in that way. It almost breaks my heart. Ah, if you could only be satisfied with your father's love!" "I will try, papa," was her usual answer. "And oh, your love is very sweet and precious." Such a little scene, occurring one morning in Elsie's boudoir, was interrupted by Chloe coming in to say that Miss Carrington had called to see her young mistress, and was waiting in the drawing-room. "Show her in here, mammy," Elsie said, disengaging herself from her father's arms, and smoothing over her dress. "She used to come here in the old times without waiting for an invitation." The Carringtons had not been able quite to forgive the rejection of Herbert's suit, and since his death there had been a slight coolness between the two families, and the girls had seen much less of each other than in earlier days, their intercourse being confined to an occasional exchange of formal calls, except when they met at the house of some common acquaintance or friend. Still they were mutually attached, and of late had resumed much of their old warmth of manner toward each other. "Ah, this seems like going back to the dear old times again," Lucy said when their greetings were over, and sending an admiring glance about the luxuriously furnished apartment as she spoke. "I always thought this was the most charming of rooms, Elsie; but how many lovely things, perfect gems of art, you have added to it since I saw it last!" "Papa's gifts to his spoiled darling, most of them," answered Elsie, with a loving look and smile directed to him. "Petted, but not spoiled," he said, returning the smile. "No, indeed, I should think not," said Lucy. "Mamma says she is the most perfectly obedient, affectionate daughter she ever saw, and I can't tell you how often I have heard her wish I was more like her." "Ah," said Elsie, "I think Mrs. Carrington has always looked at me through rose-coloured spectacles." After a little more chat, Lucy told her errand. Her parents and herself, indeed the whole family, she said, had greatly regretted the falling off of their former intimacy, and strongly desired to renew it; and she had come to beg Elsie to go home with her, and spend a week at Ashlands in the old familiar way. Elsie's eye brightened, and her cheek flushed. "Dear Lucy, how kind!" she exclaimed, then turned inquiringly to her father. "Yes, it is very kind," he said. "Use your own pleasure, daughter. I think perhaps the change might do you good." "Thanks, papa, then I shall go. Lucy, I accept your invitation with pleasure." They were soon on their way, cantering briskly along side by side, Lucy in gay, almost wild spirits, and Elsie's depression rapidly vanishing beneath the combined influence of the bracing air and exercise, the brilliant sunshine, and her friend's lively sallies. Arrived at Ashlands, she found herself received and welcomed with all the old warmth of affection. Mrs. Carrington folded her to her heart and wept over her. "My poor boy," she whispered, "it seems almost to bring him back again to have you with us once more. But I will not mourn," she added, wiping her eyes, "for our loss has been his great gain." Tender memories of Herbert, associated with nearly every room in the house, saddened and subdued Elsie's spirit for a time. It helped to banish thoughts of Egerton from her mind. But Lucy had a great deal to tell her, and in listening to these girlish confidences, Herbert was again half forgotten. Lucy, too, had spent the past summer in the North, and had there met her fate. She was engaged, the course of true love seemed to be running smoothly, and they expected to marry in a year. Elsie listened with interest, sympathizing warmly in her friend's happiness; but Lucy, who was watching her keenly, noticed a shade of deep sadness steal over her face. "Now I have told you all my secrets," she said, "won't you treat me as generously by trusting me with yours?" "If I had as happy a tale to tell," replied Elsie, the tears filling her eyes. "You poor dear, what is wrong? Is it that papa refuses his consent?" Elsie nodded; her heart was too full for speech. "What a shame!" cried Lucy. "Does he really mean to keep you single all your life? Is he quite determined to make an old maid of you?" "No, oh no! But he does not believe my friend to be a good man. There seems to be some sad mistake, and I cannot blame papa, because if Mr. Egerton really was what he thinks him, it would be folly and sin for me to have anything to do with him; and indeed I could not give either hand or heart to one so vile, a profane swearer, gambler, drunkard, and rake." "Oh my, no!" said Lucy, looking quite horrified. "But you don't believe him such a villain?" "No; on the contrary, I think him a truly converted man. I believe he was a little wild at one time, for he told me he had been; but I believe, too, that he has truly repented, and therefore ought to be forgiven." Then I wouldn't give him up if I were you, father or no father," remarked Lucy with spirit. "But, Lucy, there is the command, 'Children, obey your parents.'" "But you are not a child." "Hardly more; not of age for more than 2 years." "Well, when you are of age, surely you will consider a lover's claims before those of a father." "No," Elsie answered, low and sadly. "I shall never marry without papa's consent. I love him far too dearly to grieve him so, and it would be running too fearful a risk." "Then you have resigned your lover entirely?" "Unless he can some day succeed in convincing papa that he is not so unworthy." "Well, you are a model of filial piety, and deserve to be happy, and I am ever so sorry for you," cried Lucy, clasping her in her arms and kissing her affectionately. "Thank you, dear," Elsie said; "but oh, I cannot bear to have my father blamed. Believing as he does, how could he do otherwise than forbid all intercourse between us? And he is so very, very kind, so tenderly affectionate to me. Ah, I could never do without his dear love." After this the two had frequent talks together on the same subject, and though Lucy did not find any fault with Mr. Dinsmore, she yet pleaded Egerton's cause, urging that it seemed very unfair in Elsie to condemn him unheard, very hard not to allow him even so much as a parting word. "I had no choice," Elsie said again and again, in a voice full of tears. "It was papa's command, and I could do nothing but obey. Oh, Lucy, it was very hard for me too, and yet my father was doing only his duty, if his judgment of Mr. Egerton's character was correct." One afternoon, when Elsie had been at Ashlands 4 or 5 days, Lucy came flying into her room. "Oh, I'm so glad to find you dressed! You see I'm in the midst of my toilet, and Skip has just brought up word that a gentleman is in the parlour asking for the young ladies, Miss Dinsmore and Miss Carrington. Would you mind going down alone and entertaining him till I come? Do, there's a dear." "Who is he?" Skip didn't seem to have quite understood the name, but it must be some one we both know, and if you don't mind going, it would be a relief to my nerves to know that he's not sitting there with nothing to do but count the minutes and think, 'What an immense time it takes Miss Carrington to dress! She must be very anxious to make a good impression upon me.' For you see men are so conceited, they are always imagining we're laying ourselves out to secure their admiration." "I will go down then," Elsie answered, smiling, "and do what I can to keep him from thinking any such unworthy thoughts of you. But please follow me as soon as you can." The caller had the drawing room to himself, and as Elsie entered was standing at the centre table with his back toward her. As she drew near, he turned abruptly, caught her hand in his, threw his arm about her waist, and kissed her passionately, crying in a low tone of rapturous delight, "My darling, I have you at last! Oh, how I have suffered from this cruel separation!" It was Egerton, and for a few moments she forgot everything else in her glad surprise at the unexpected meeting. He drew her to a sofa, and, still keeping his arm about her, poured out a torrent of fond, lover like words, mingled with tender reproaches that she had given him up so easily, and protestations of his innocence of the vices and crimes laid to his charge. At first Elsie blushed rosy red, and a sweet light of love and joy shone in the soft eyes, half veiled by their heavy, drooping lashes. But as she went on, her cheek grew deathly pale, and she struggled to free herself from his embrace. "Let me go!" she cried, in an agitated tone of earnest entreaty. "I must, indeed I must! I can't stay, I ought not! I should not have come in or allowed you to speak to or touch me. Papa has forbidden all intercourse between us, and he will be so angry!" and she burst into tears. "Then don't go back to him; stay with me, and give me a right to protect you from his anger. I can't bear to see you weep, and if you will be mine, my own little wife, you shall never have cause to shed another tear," he said, drawing her closer to him and kissing them away. "No, no, I cannot, I cannot! You must let me go, indeed you must!" she cried, shrinking from the touch of his lip upon her cheek, and averting her face. "I am doing wrong, very wrong, to stay here." "No, I shall hold you fast for a few blissful moments at least," he answered, tightening his grasp and repeating his caresses as she struggled the harder to be free. "You cannot be so cruel as to refuse to hear my defence." "Oh, I cannot stay another moment. I must not hear another word, for every instant that I linger I am guilty of a fresh act of disobedience to papa. I shall be compelled to call for help if you do not loose your hold." He took his arm from her waist, but still held fast to her hand. "No, don't do that," he said. "Think what a talk it would make. I shall detain you but a moment, and surely you may as well stay that much longer. In for a penny, in for a pound, you know. Oh, Elsie, can't you give me a little hope?" "If you can gain papa's approval, not otherwise." "But when you come of age?" "I shall never marry without my father's consent." "Surely you carry your ideas of obedience too far. You owe a duty to yourself and to me as well as to your father. Excuse my plainness, but in the course of nature we shall both outlive him, and is it right to sacrifice the happiness of our two lives because he has unfortunately imbibed a prejudice against me?" "I could expect no blessing upon a union entered into in direct opposition to my father's wishes and commands," she answered with sad and gentle firmness. "That's a hard kind of obedience, and I don't think it would answer to put in practice in all cases," he said bitterly. "Perhaps not. I do not attempt to decide for others, but I am convinced of my own duty, and know too that I should be wretched indeed if I had to live under papa's frown. And oh, how I am disobeying him now! I must go this instant. Release my hand, Mr. Egerton," and she tried with all her strength to wrench it free. "No, no, not yet," he said entreatingly. "I have not given you half the proofs of my innocence that I can bring forward. Do me the simple justice to stay and hear them." She made no reply, but half yielded, ceasing her struggles for a moment. She had no strength to free her hand from his grasp, and could not bear to call others upon the scene. Trembling with agitation and eagerness, she waited for his promised proofs, but instead he only poured forth a continuous stream of protestations, expostulations, and entreaties. "Mr. Egerton, I must go," she repeated. "This is nothing to the purpose, and I cannot stay to hear it." A step was heard approaching. He hastily drew her toward him, touched his lips again to her cheek, released her, and she darted from the room by one door, as Lucy entered by another. "Where is she? Gone? What's the matter? Wasn't she pleased to see you? Wouldn't she stay?" Lucy looked into the disappointed, angry, chagrined face of Egerton, and in her surprise and vexation piled question upon question without giving him time to answer. "No, the girl's a fool," he muttered angrily, and turned hastily from her, paced rapidly to and fro for a moment. Then suddenly recollecting himself, "I beg pardon, Miss Carrington," he said, coming back to the sofa, on which she sat regarding him with a perturbed, displeased countenance. I forgot myself. But you will, perhaps, know how to excuse an almost distracted lover." "Really, sir," returned Lucy coolly, "your words just now did not sound very lover-like, and would rather lead one to suspect that possibly Mr. Dinsmore may be in the right." He flushed hotly. "What can you mean, Miss Carrington?" "That your love is for her fortune rather than for herself." "Indeed, you wrong me. I adore Miss Dinsmore, and would consider myself the happiest of mortals could I but secure her hand, even though she came to me penniless. But she has imbibed the most absurd, ridiculous ideas of filial duty, and refuses to give me the smallest encouragement unless I can gain her father's consent and approval, which, seeing he has conceived a violent dislike to me, is a hopeless thing. Now, can you not realize that the more ardent my love for her, the more frantically impatient I would feel under such treatment?" "Perhaps so. Men are so different from women. But nothing could ever make me apply such an epithet to the man I loved." "Distracted with disappointed hopes, I was hardly a sane man at the moment, Miss Carrington," he said deprecatingly. "The coveted interview has proved entirely unsatisfactory, then?" she said in a tone of inquiry.
"Yes, and yet I am most thankful to have had sight and speech of her once more, truly grateful to you for bringing it about so cleverly. But, oh, Miss Carrington, could you be persuaded to assist me still further? You would lay me under lasting obligations."
"Please explain yourself, sir," she answered coldly, moving farther from him as he attempted to take her hand.
"Excuse me," he said, "I am not one inclined to take liberties with ladies. But I am hardly myself to-day. My overpowering emotion, my half-distracted state of mind—" breaking off his sentence abruptly and putting his hand to his head, "I believe I shall go mad if I have to resign all hope of winning the sweet, lovely Elsie," he exclaimed excitedly. "And I see only one way of doing it. If I could carry her off, and get her quite out of her father's reach, so that no fear of him need deter her from following the promptings of her own heart, I am sure I could induce her to consent to marry me at once. Miss Carrington, will you help me?"
"Never! If Elsie chooses to run away with you, and wants any assistance from me, she shall have it. But I will have nothing to do with kidnapping." He urged, entreated, used every argument he could think of, but with no other effect than rousing Lucy's anger and indignation. Underhand dealings were not in her line, she told him, and finally, upon his intimating that what she had already done might be thought to come under that head, almost ordered him out of the house. He went, and hurrying to her friend's room, she found her walking about in a state of great agitation, and weeping bitterly. "Oh, Lucy, how could you? How could you?" she cried, wringing her hands and sobbing in pitiable distress. "I had no thought of him when I went down. I did not know you knew him, or that he was in this part of the country at all. I was completely taken by surprise, and have disobeyed papa's most express commands. And he will never forgive me, never! No, not that either, but he will be very, very angry. Oh, what shall I do?" "Oh, Elsie, dear, don't be so troubled. I am as sorry as I can be," said Lucy, with tears in her eyes. "I meant to do you a kindness, indeed I did. I thought it would be a joyful surprise to you. I met him last summer at Saratoga. He came there immediately from Lansdale, and somehow we found out directly that we both knew you, and that I was a near neighbour and very old friend of yours. And he told me the whole story of your love affair, and quite enlisted me in his cause. He seemed so depressed and melancholy at your loss, and grieved so over the hasty way in which your father had separated you, not even allowing a word of farewell. He told me he hoped and believed you were still faithful to him in your heart, but he could not get to see or speak to you, or hold any correspondence with you. And so I arranged this way of bringing you together. It was kindly meant, I have no doubt, Lucy, but oh, you don't know what you have done! I tremble at the very thought of papa's anger when he hears it, for I have done and permitted things he said he would not allow for thousands of dollars. Well, dear, I don't think you could help it, and I'm so sorry for my share in it," said Lucy, putting her arms around her and kissing her wet cheek. "But perhaps your father will not be so very angry with you after all, and at any rate you are too old to be whipped, so a scolding will be the worst you will be likely to get." "He never did whip me, never struck me a blow in his life; but I would prefer the pain of a dozen whippings to what I expect," said Elsie, with a fresh burst of tears. "What is that, you poor dear?" asked Lucy. "I can't imagine what he could do worse than beat you." "He may put me away from his arms for weeks or months, and be cold and stern and distant to me, never giving me a caress, or even so much as a kind word or look. Oh, if he should do that, how can I bear it?" "Well, don't tell him anything about it. I wouldn't, and I don't see any reason why you should." Elsie shook her head sorrowfully. "I must. I never conceal anything, any secret of my own, from him, and I should feel like a guilty thing, acting a lie, and could not look him in the face. and he would know from my very look and manner that something was wrong, and would question me, and make me tell him all. Lucy, I must go home at once." "No, indeed, you must not. Why, you were to stay a week, 2 days longer than this, and if you were ready to start this minute, it would be quite dark before you could possibly reach the Oaks." Elsie looked at her watch, and perceiving that her friend was right, gave up the idea of going that day, but said she must leave the next morning. To that Lucy again objected. "I can't bear to lose those 2 days of your promised visit," she said, "for if you are determined to tell your papa all about this, there's no knowing when he will allow you to come here again." "Never, I fear," sighed Elsie. "I haven't been able to help feeling a little hard to him on poor Herbert's account," Lucy went on, "and I believe that had something to do with my readiness to help Egerton to outwit him in obtaining an interview with you. But I'll never do anything of the kind again, so he needn't be afraid to let you come to see us." She then told Elsie what had passed in the drawing room between Egerton and herself, his request and her indignant refusal. It helped to shake Elsie's confidence in the man, and made her still more remorseful in view of that day's disobedience, for she could not deceive herself into the belief that she had been altogether blameless. "As I said before, I can't bear the idea of losing you so soon," continued Lucy; "but there is still another reason why I must beg of you to stay till the set time of your leaving. Mamma knows nothing about this affair, and would be exceedingly displeased with me if she should find it out, as of course she must if you go to morrow, as that would naturally call out an explanation. So, dear, do promise me that you will give up the idea." Elsie hesitated, but not liking to bring Lucy into trouble, finally yielded to her urgent entreaties, and consented to stay. All the enjoyment of her visit, however, was over. She felt it impossible to rest till her father knew all, shed many tears in secret, and had much ado to conceal the traces of them, and appear cheerful in the presence of the family. But the 2 wretched days were over at last, and declining the urgent invitations of her friends to linger with them a little longer, she bade them an affectionate farewell, and set out for home. Jim had been sent to escort her, another servant with the waggon for Chloe and the luggage. Struck with a sudden fear that she might meet or be overtaken by Egerton, Elsie ordered Jim to keep up close in the rear, then touching the whip to her horse, started off at a brisk canter. Her thoughts were full of the coming interview with her father, which she dreaded exceedingly, while at the same time she longed to have it over. She drew rein at the great gates leading into the grounds, and the servant dismounted and opened them. "Jim," she asked, "is your master at home?"
"Dunno, Miss Elsie, but the missus am gone over to Ion to spend the day, and left little Marse Horace at Roselands."
"Why, what's the matter, Jim?"
"The missus at Ion li'l bit sick, I believe, Miss Elsie."
"And papa didn't go with them?"
"Yes, miss, but he comed right back again, and I 'spect he's in de house now."
"Dear papa, he came back to receive me," murmured Elsie to herself as she rode on, and a scalding tear fell at the thought of how the loving look and fond caress with which he was sure to greet her would be quickly exchanged for dark frowns and stern, cold reproofs. "Oh, if I were a child again, I believe I should hope he would just whip me at once, and then forgive me, and it would be all over. But now, oh dear, how long will his displeasure last?" It was just as she had expected. He was on the verandah, watching for her coming, hastened forward, assisted her to alight, embraced her tenderly, then pushing aside her veil, looked searchingly into her face. "What is the matter?" he asked, as her eyes met his for an instant with a beseeching, imploring glance, then fell beneath his gaze, while her face flushed crimson. She tried to answer him, but her tongue refused to do its office. There was a choking sensation in her throat, and her lips quivered. He led her into his private study, took off her hat and threw it aside, and seating her on a sofa, still keeping his arm around her, for she was trembling very much, asked again, "What is the matter? What has gone wrong with you, my daughter?" His tone, His look, his manner were very gentle and tender, but that only increased her remorse and self-reproach. "Papa, don't be so kind," she faltered. I don't deserve it, for I have disobeyed you." "Is it possible? When? Where? And how? Can it be that you have seen and spoken with that scoundrel, Elsie?" "Yes, papa." Her voice was very low and tremulous. Her heart throbbed almost to suffocation. Her bosom heaved tumultuously, and her colour came and went with every breath. He rose and paced hurriedly across the room 2 or 3 times, then coming back to her side, "Tell me all about it," he said sternly. "Every action, every word spoken by either, as far as you can recall it." She obeyed in the same low, tremulous tones in which she had answered him before, her voice now and then broken by a half-smothered sob, and her eyes never once meeting his, which she felt were fixed so severely upon her tearful, downcast face. He cross-questioned her till he knew all that had passed nearly as well as if he had been present through the whole interview, his tones growing more and more stern and angry. "And you dared to permit all that, Elsie?" he exclaimed when she had finished. "To allow that vile wretch to put his arm around you, hold your hand in his, for half an hour probably, and even to press his lips again and again to yours or to your cheek, and that after I had told you I would not have him take such a liberty with you for half I am worth, and—" "Not to my lips, papa." "Then it is not quite so bad as I thought, but bad enough certainly. And all this after I had positively forbidden you to even so much as exchange the slightest salutation with him. What am I to think of such high-handed rebellion?" "Papa," she said beseechingly, "is not that too hard a word? I did not disobey deliberately. I don't think anything could have induced me to go into that room knowing that he was there. I was taken by surprise, and when he had got hold of my hand I tried in vain to get it free."
"Don't attempt to excuse yourself, Elsie. You could have escaped from him at once, by simply raising your voice and calling for assistance. I do not believe it would have been impossible to avoid even that first embrace, and it fairly makes my blood boil to think he succeeded in giving it to you. How dared you so disobey me as to submit to it?"
"Papa, at the moment I forgot everything but just that he was there." The last words were spoken in a voice scarcely raised above a whisper, while her head drooped lower and lower, and her cheek grew hot with shame.
"Did I ever take forgetfulness of my orders as any excuse of disobedience?" he asked in as stern a tone as he had ever used to her.
"No, papa, but oh, don't be very angry with me."
"I am exceedingly displeased with you, Elsie, so much so that nothing but your sex saves you from a severe chastisement, and I cannot allow you to escape punishment. You must be taught that though no longer a mere child, you are not yet old enough to disobey me with impunity. Hush!" as she seemed about to speak. "I will not have a word of reply. Go to your own apartments, and consider yourself confined to them till you hear further from me. Stay!" he added as she rose to obey. "When did all this occur?" She told him in her low, tearful tones, her utterance half choked with sobs. 2 days ago, and yet your confession has been delayed till now. Does that look like penitence for your fault?" She explained why she had not returned home at once, but he refused to accept the excuse, and ordered her away as sternly as before. She obeyed in silence, controlling her feelings by a great effort until she had gained the privacy of her own apartments, then giving way to a fit of almost hysterical weeping. It was years since her father had been seriously displeased with her, and loving him with such intense affection, his anger and sternness nearly broke her heart. Her tender conscience pricked her sorely too, adding greatly to her distress by its reproaches on account of her disobedience and her delay in confessing it. It came to her mind at length that her heavenly Father might be more tender and forbearing with her, more ready to forgive and restore to favour than her earthly one. She remembered the sweet words, "There is forgiveness with thee, that thou mayst be feared."
If any man sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous." She went to him with her sin and sorrow, asking pardon for the past and help for the future. She asked, too, that the anger of her earthly parent might be turned away, that the Lord would dispose him to forgive and love her as before. She rose from her knees with a heart, though still sad and sorrowful, yet lightened of more than half its load. But the day was a very long one, with a mind so disturbed she could not settle to any employment, or find amusement in anything. She passed the time in wandering restlessly from room to room, starting and trembling as now and then she thought she heard her father's step or voice, then weeping afresh as she found that he did not come near her. When the dinner bell rang, she hoped he would send or come to her, but instead he sent her meal to her, such an one as was usual upon their table, both luxurious and abundant, which comforted her with the hope that he was less displeased with her than at other times when he had allowed her little more than prison fare. But excitement and mental distress had brought on a severe headache. She had no appetite, and sent the food away almost untasted. It was mild, beautiful weather in the early spring, such weather as makes one feel it a trial to be compelled to stay within doors, and Elsie longed for her favourite retreat in the grounds. In the afternoon some ladies called. Mr. Dinsmore was out, and she dared not go to the drawing-room without permission, but her headache furnished sufficient excuse for declining to see them, and they went away. Shortly after, she heard her father's return. He had not been off the estate, or out of sight of the house. He was keeping guard over her, but still did not come near her. Just at tea-time she again heard the sound of wheels, then her father's, mother's, and little brother's voices. "Mamma and Horace have come home," she thought, with a longing desire to run out and embrace them. "Oh, papa, has sister come home?" she heard the child's voice ask in eager tones. "Yes." "Oh, then I must run into her room and kiss her." "No, you must not. Stay here." "But why mustn't I go to sister, papa?" "Because I forbid it." Every word of the short colloquy reached Elsie's ear, adding to her grief and dismay. Was she, then, to be separated from all the rest of the family? Did her father fear that she would exert a bad influence over Horace, teaching him to be disobedient and wilful? How deeply humbled and ashamed she felt at the thought. Rose gave her husband a look of surprised, anxious inquiry. "Is Elsie sick, dear?" she asked. "No, Rose, but she is in disgrace with me," he answered in an undertone, as he led the way into the house. "Horace, you astonish me. What can she have done to displease you?" "Come in here, and I will tell you," he said, throwing open the door of his study. Rose listened in silence while he repeated to her the substance of Elsie's confession, mingled with the expressions of his own anger and indignation. "Poor child!" murmured Rose, as he concluded. "Horace, don't be hard with her. She must have suffered a great deal in these last 3 days." "Yes," he answered in a moved tone. "When I think of that, I can scarce refrain from going to her, taking her in my arms, and lavishing caresses and endearments upon her. But then comes the thought of her allowing that scoundrel to do the same, and I am ready almost to whip her for it." His face flushed hotly, and his dark eyes flashed as he spoke. "Oh, my dear!" exclaimed Rose, half frightened at his vehemence, "you cannot mean it." "Rose," he said, pacing to and fro in increasing excitement, "the fellow is a vile wretch, whose very touch I esteem pollution to a sweet, fair, innocent young creature like my daughter. I told her so, and positively forbade her so much as to look at him, or permit him to see her face, if it could be avoided, or to recognize or hold the slightest communication with him in any way. Yet, in defiance of all this, she allows him to take her hand and hold it for I don't know how long, put his arm around her waist and kiss her a number of times. Now what does such disobedience deserve?" "Had she no excuse to offer?" "Excuse? Yes, she did not disobey deliberately, was taken by surprise, forgot everything but that he was there." "Well, my dear," and Rose's hand was laid affectionately on his arm, while a tender smile played about her mouth, and her sweet blue eyes looked fondly into his. "You know how it is with lovers, if you will only look back a very few years. I think there were times when you and I forgot that there was anybody in the wide world but just our two selves." A smile, a tender caress, a few very lover-like words, and resuming his gravity and seriousness, Mr. Dinsmore went on: "But you forget the odious character of the man. If I had objected to him from mere prejudice or whim, it would have been a very different thing." "But you know Elsie does not believe—" "She ought to believe what her father tells her," he interrupted hotly. "But believe it or not, she must and shall obey me, and if she does not I shall punish her." "And to do that you need only look coldly on her, and refrain from giving her caresses and endearing words. Such treatment from her dearly loved father would of itself be sufficient, very soon, to crush her tender, sensitive spirit." His face softened, the frown left his brow, and the angry fire his eye. "My poor darling," he murmured with a sigh, his thoughts going back to a time of estrangement between them long years ago. "Yes, Rose, you are right. She is a very tender, delicate, sensitive plant, and it behooves her father to be exceedingly gentle and forbearing with her." "Then you will forgive her, and take her to your heart again?" "Yes, if she is penitent, and tell her that she owes it to her mother's intercession, for I had intended to make her feel herself in disgrace for days or weeks." Chloe was at that moment carrying a large silver waiter, filled with delicacies, into the apartments of her young mistress. "Now, darling, do try to eat to please your old mammy," she said coaxingly, as she set it down before her. "I'se taken lots of pains to fix up dese things dat my pet child's so fond ob." Elsie's only answer was a sad sort of smile, but for the sake of the loving heart that had prompted the careful preparation of the tempting meal, the loving eyes that watched her as she ate, she tried to do her best. Only half satisfied with the result, Chloe bore the waiter away again, while Elsie seated herself in a large easy chair that was drawn up close to the glass doors opening upon the lawn, and, laying her head back upon its cushions, turned her eyes toward the outer world, looking longingly upon the shaded alleys and gay parterres, the lawn with its velvet carpet of emerald green, where a fountain cast up its cool showers of spray, and long shadows slept, alternating with brilliant patches of ruddy light from the slowly sinking sun. She sighed deeply, and her eyes filled with tears. How long should she be forbidden to wander there at her own sweet will? A soft, cool hand was gently laid upon her aching brow, and, looking up, she saw her father standing by her side. She had not heard his approach, for his slippered feet made no noise in passing over the rich velvet carpet. His face was grave, but no longer stern or angry. "Does your head ache, daughter?" he asked, almost tenderly. "Yes, papa, but not half so badly as my heart does," she answered, a tear rolling quickly down her cheek. "I am so sorry for my disobedience. Oh, papa, will you forgive me?" And her eyes sought his with the imploring look he ever found it well nigh impossible to resist. "Yes, I will. I do," he said, stooping to press a kiss upon the quivering lips. "I had thought I ought to keep you in disgrace some time longer, but your mamma has pleaded for you, and for her sake, and for the sake of a time long ago when I caused my little girl much undeserved suffering," he added, his tones growing tremulous with emotion, "I forgive and receive you back into favour at once." She threw her arm about his neck, and as he drew her to his breast, laid her head down there, weeping tears of joy and thankfulness. "Dear, kind mamma, and you too, best and dearest of fathers, I don't deserve it," she sobbed. "I am afraid I ought to be punished for such disobedience." "I think you have been," he said pityingly. "The last 3 days can hardly have been very happy ones to you." "No, papa, very, very wretched." "My poor child! Ah, I must take better care of my precious one in future. I shall allow you to go nowhere without either your mother or myself to guard and protect you. Also, I shall break off your intimacy with Lucy Carrington. She is henceforth to be to you a mere speaking acquaintance. Come, now we will take a little stroll through the grounds. The cool air will, I hope, do your head good." End of chapter 21. Recording by Leda Blair, North Mankato, Minnesota.
Chapter 22 of Elsie's Girlhood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by GabrielleC. Elsie's Girlhood by Martha Finley. Chapter 22. 'Twas a doubt that thou wert false that wrung my heart with pain, but now I know thy perfidy, I shall be well again. Bryant. Elsie submitted without a murmur to her father's requirements and restrictions, but though there was nothing else to remind her that she had been for one sad day in disgrace with him, his manner toward her having again all the old tender fondness, she did not fully recover her spirits, but, spite of her struggles to be cheerful and hopeful, seemed often depressed, and grew pale and thin day by day. Her father noticed it with deep concern and anxiety. "Something must be done," he said one day to his wife. "The child is drooping strangely, and I fear will lose her health. I must try what change will do for her. What do you say to a year in Europe?" "For all of us?" "Yes, for you and me and our 2 children. It might be very pleasant, and Elsie has never been." "No, I have always meant to take her, but found home so enjoyable that I have put it off from year to year." Elsie entered the room as he spoke. "Come here, daughter," he said, making room for her on the sofa by his side. "I was just saying to Mamma that I think of taking you all to Europe for a year. How should you like that?" "Oh, very much, Papa," she answered, looking up brightly. "I should so enjoy seeing all the places you have told me of, all the scenes of your adventures when you traveled there before." "Then I think we will go. Shall we not, Mamma?" "Yes, but I must pay a visit home first and do some preparatory shopping in Philadelphia. Could we go on in time to spend some weeks there before sailing?" "You might, my dear, but I shall have to stay behind to arrange matters here, which will take some time, in contemplation of so lengthened an absence from the estate." "Then I suppose we must have a temporary separation," said Rose in a jesting tone. "I had better take the children and go home at once, so that Elsie and I can be getting through our shopping, etc., while you are busy here." "No, Rose. You may go, and take Horace with you, if you like, but Elsie must stay with me. I cannot trust her even with you." "Oh, Papa!" And the sweet face flushed crimson, the soft eyes filled with tears. "I think you must understand me, daughter," he said kindly. "I do not mean that I fear you would fail in obedience to my commands or my wishes, but that I must keep you under my protection. Besides, I cannot possibly spare all my treasures, wife, son, and daughter, at once. Would you wish to go and leave me quite alone?" "Oh, no, no, indeed, you dear, dearest father," she cried, putting her arm around his neck and gazing in his eyes with eyes beaming with joy and love. "Yours is the better plan, I believe, my dear," said Rose. "I would rather not have left you alone, and I think I could do what is necessary for Elsie in the way of shopping and ordering dresses made, if she likes to trust me." So it was arranged. 3 days after this conversation Mrs. Dinsmore left for Philadelphia, taking little Horace with her, and a fortnight later Mr. Dinsmore followed with Elsie. Dearly as the young girl loved Rose and her little brother, it had yet been an intense pleasure to her to have her father all to herself and be everything to him for those 2 weeks, and she was almost sorry to have them come to an end. It was late at night when they reached the city of brotherly love. Mr. Allison's residence was several miles distant from the depot, but his carriage was there and waiting for them. "Are the family all well, Davis?" inquired Mr. Dinsmore, addressing the coachman, as he placed Elsie in the vehicle. "All well, sir. Mrs. Dinsmore and the little boy too." "Ah, I am thankful for that. You may drive on at once. My man John will call a hack and follow us with Aunt Chloe and the baggage." "Did you give John the checks, Papa?" asked Elsie as he took his seat by her side and David shut the carriage door. "Yes. How weary you look, my poor child. There, lean on me," and he put his arm about her and made her lay her head on his shoulder. They drove on rapidly, passing through several comparatively silent and deserted streets. Then suddenly the horses slackened their pace. A bright light shone in at the carriage window, and the hum of many voices and the sound of many feet attracted the attention of the travelers. Elsie started and raised her head, asking, "What is it, Papa?" "We are passing a theater, and it seems the play is just over, judging by the crowds that are pouring from its doors." Davis reined in his horses to avoid running over those who were crossing the street, and Elsie, glancing from the window, caught sight of a face she knew only too well. Its owner was in the act of stepping from the door of the theater, and staggered as he did so, would have fallen to the ground had he not been helped up by his companion, a gaudily dressed, brazen-faced woman, whose character there was no mistaking. "Ha, ha, Tom!" she cried with a loud and boisterous laugh. "I saved you from a downfall that time, which I'll be bound is more than that Southern heiress of yours would have done." "Now don't be throwing her up to me again, Bet," he answered thickly, reeling along so close to our travelers that they caught the scent of his breath. "I tell you again she can't hold a candle to you, and I never cared for her. It was the money I was after." Mr. Dinsmore saw a deadly pallor suddenly overspread his daughter's face. For a single instant her eyes sought his with an expression of mute despairing agony that wrung his heart. Then all was darkness as again the carriage rolled rapidly onward. "My poor, poor darling," he murmured, drawing her close to him and folding his arms about her as if he would shield her from every danger and evil, while hers crept around his neck and her head dropped upon his breast. The carriage rattled on over the rough stones. Elsie clung with death-like grasp to her father, shudder after shudder shaking her whole frame, in utter silence at first, but at length, as they came upon a smoother road and moved with less noise and jolting, "Papa," she whispered, "oh, what a fearful, fearful fate you have saved me from! Thank God for a father's protecting love and care." "Thank him that I have my darling safe," he responded in a deeply moved tone, and caressing her with exceeding tenderness. In another moment they had stopped before Mr. Allison's door, which was thrown wide open almost on the instant, for Rose and Edward were up, waiting and listening for their coming. "Come at last! Glad to see you!" cried the latter, springing down the steps to greet his brother-in-law as he alighted. Then, as Mr. Dinsmore turned, lifted his daughter from the carriage and half carried her into the house. "But what's the matter? Elsie ill? Hurt? Have you had an accident?" Rose stood waiting in the hall. "My dear husband!" she exclaimed in a tone of mingled affection, surprise, and alarm. "What is it? What is wrong with our darling? Come this way, into the sitting room, and lay her on the sofa." "She has received a heavy blow, Rose, but I hope it will turn out for her good in the end," he said low and tremulously as he laid her down. She seemed in a half-fainting condition, and Edward rushed away in search of restoratives. Rose asked no more questions at the time, nor did her husband give any further information, but in silence, broken only now and then by a subdued whisper, they both devoted their energies to Elsie's restoration. "Shall we go for a doctor?" asked Edward. "No, thank you. I think she will be better presently," answered Mr. Dinsmore. "I am better now," murmured Elsie feebly. "Papa, if you will help me up into bed, I shall do very well." "Can't you eat something first?" asked Rose. "I have a nice little supper set out in the next room for Papa and you." Elsie shook her head and sighed. "I don't think I could, Mamma. I am not at all hungry." "I want you to try, though," said her father. "It is some hours now since you tasted food, and I think you need it." And lifting her tenderly in his arms, he carried her into the supper room, where he seated her at the table in an easy chair which Edward hastily wheeled up for her use. To please her father she made a determined effort, and succeeded in swallowing a few mouthfuls. After that he helped her to her room and left her in the care of Rose and Chloe. Having seen with her own eyes and heard with her own ears, Elsie could no longer doubt the utter unworthiness of Edgerton, or his identity with Tom Jackson, of whose vices and crimes she had heard from both her father and Walter, with whom she still kept up a correspondence. She loved him no longer, nay, she had never loved him. Her affection had been bestowed upon the man she believed him to be, not the man that he was. But now the scales had fallen from her eyes. She saw him in all his hideous moral deformity, and shrank with horror and loathing from the recollection that his arm had once encircled her waist, his lip touched her cheek. She could now appreciate her father's feelings of anger and indignation on learning that she had permitted such liberties, and felt more deeply humbled and penitent on account of it than ever before. She slept little that night, and did not leave her room for several days. The sudden shock had quite unnerved her, but the cause of her illness remained a secret between herself and her parents, who watched over her with the tenderest solicitude, and spared no effort to cheer and comfort her. She seemed at this time to shrink from all companionship but theirs, although she and her mamma's younger brothers and sisters had always entertained a warm friendship for each other. On the 4th day after their arrival, her father took her out for a drive, and returning left her resting on the sofa in her dressing room, while he and Rose went for a short walk. The doorbell rang, and presently Chloe came up with a very smiling face to ask if Marse Walter might come in. "Walter?" cried Elsie, starting up. "Yes, indeed." She had scarcely spoken the words before he was there beside her, shaking hands and kissing her, saying, with a gay boyish laugh, "I suppose your uncle has a right?" "Yes, certainly, though I don't know when he ever claimed it before. But oh, how glad I am to see you, and how you've grown and improved. Sit down, do. There's an easy chair. Excuse my not getting up. Papa bade me lie and rest for an hour." "Thanks, yes, and I know you always obey orders. And so you're on the sick list? What's the matter?" An expression of pain crossed her features, and the color faded from her cheek. "I have been ailing a little," she said, "but am better now. How is Arthur?" Well enough physically, but in horrible disgrace with Papa. You've no idea, Elsie, to what an extent that Tom Jackson has fleeced him. He's over head and ears in debt, and my father's furious. He has put the whole matter into Horace's hands for settlement. Did he tell you about it?" "No, he only said he expected to go to Princeton tomorrow to attend to some business. He would have gone sooner, but didn't like to leave me." "Careful of you as ever. That's right. I say, Elsie, I think Horace has very sensible ideas about matters and things." "Do you? I own I think so myself," she answered with a quiet smile. "Yes, you see Arthur is in some debt, some thousands, a good share of it what they call debts of honor. Papa had some doubt as to whether they ought to be paid, and asked Horace what was his opinion. Adelaide wrote me the whole story, you see. Here, I'll give it to you in his exact words as she reports them," he added, taking a letter from his pocket and reading aloud. "Father, don't think of such a thing. Why, surely it would be encouraging gambling, which is a ruinous vice, and paying a man for robbing and cheating. I would, if necessary, part with the last cent to pay an honest debt, but a so-called debt of honor, if dishonor would be more correct, I would not pay if I had more money than I could find other uses for." "And I think he was right, don't you?" concluded Walter. "I think Papa is always right." "Yes? Well, I was afraid you didn't think he was in regard to that fellow you met out in Lansdale. I've been waiting to see you to tell you what I think of the scoundrelism of Tom Jackson, and the proof that they are one and the same." "Yes, I know. I believe it now, Walter, and but don't let us speak of that again," she faltered, turning deathly pale and almost gasping for breath. "I won't. I didn't know you might. I'm very sorry," he stammered, looking anxious and vexed with himself. "Never mind. I shall soon learn not to care. Now tell me about Arthur. Will he stay and finish his course?" "No. Papa says his patience is worn out, and his purse can stand no more such strains as Arthur has put upon it 2 or 3 times already. So he is to leave and go home as soon as Horace has settled up his affairs. And you?" "I hope to go on and to graduate in another year." "Oh, Wal, I'm so glad. So thankful you haven't followed in poor Arthur's footsteps." "He wouldn't let me, Elsie. He actually wouldn't. I know I'm lacking in self-reliance and firmness, and if Art had chosen to lead me wrong, I'm afraid he would have succeeded. But he says, poor fellow, that it's enough for one to be a disgrace to the family, and has tried to keep me out of temptation. And you can't think how much my correspondence with you has helped to keep me straight. Your letters always did me so much good." "Oh, thank you for telling me that," she cried, with bright, glad tears glistening in her eyes. "No, 'tis I that owe thanks to you," he said, looking down meditatively at the carpet and twirling his watch key between his finger and thumb. "Poor Art, this ought to have been his last year, and doubtless would if he had only kept out of bad company. Ah, Wal, I hope you'll never forget that evil communications corrupt bad manners." "I hope not, Elsie. I wish you could stay and attend our commencement. What do you say? Can't you? It comes off in about a fortnight." "No, Wal, I'm longing to get away, and Papa has engaged our passage in the next steamer. But perhaps we may return in time to see you graduate next year." "What, in such haste to leave America? I'm afraid you are losing your patriotism," he said playfully. "Ah, it is no want of love for my dear native land that makes me impatient to be gone," she answered half sadly. "And are you really to be gone a year?" "So Papa intends, but of course everything in this world is uncertain." "I shall look anxiously for my European letters, and expect them to be very interesting." "I'll do my best, Wal," she said languidly, "but I don't feel, just now, as if I could ever write anything worth reading." "I think I never saw you so blue," he said in a lively, jesting tone. "I must tell you of the fun we fellows have, and if it doesn't make you wish yourself one of us, well," and he launched out into an animated description of various practical jokes played off by the students upon their professors or on each other. He succeeded at length in coaxing some of the old brightness into her sweet face, and as Mr. and Mrs. Dinsmore, mounting the stairs on their return from their walk, exchanged glances of delighted surprise at the sound of a silvery laugh which had not greeted their ears for days. Walter received a hearty welcome from both. His visit, though necessarily short, was of real service to Elsie, doing much to rouse her out of herself and her grief, thus beginning the cure which time and change of scene, dulling the keen edge of sorrow and disappointment, and giving pleasant occupation to her thoughts, would at length carry on to completion. End of chapter 22. Recording by GabrielleC. Chapter 23 of Elsie's Girlhood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by GabrielleC. Elsie's Girlhood by Martha Finley. Chapter 23. The shaken tree grows firmer at the roots, so love grows firmer for some blasted doubt. It was 2 years or more since the Oaks had suffered the temporary loss of his master and mistress, yet they had not returned. They still lingered on foreign shores, and Mrs. Murray, who had been left at the head of household affairs, looked in vain for news of their homecoming. She now and then received a short business letter from Mr. Dinsmore, or of directions from Rose, or a longer one from the latter or Elsie, giving entertaining bits of travel, etc., and occasionally Adelaide would ride over from Roselands and delight the old housekeeper's heart by reading aloud a lively gossipy epistle one or the other had addressed to her. How charmed and interested were both reader and listener, especially when they came upon one of Rose's graphic accounts of their presentation at court, in London, Paris, Vienna, or St. Petersburg, wherein she gave a minute description of Elsie's dress and appearance, and dwelt with motherly pride and delight upon the admiration everywhere accorded to the beauty and sweetness of the lovely American heiress. It was a great gratification to Adelaide's pride in her niece to learn that more than one coronet had been laid at her feet, yet she was not sorry to hear that they had been rejected with the gentle firmness which she knew Elsie was capable of exercising. But what more could the banner or her father desire? Would he keep the sweet lassie single all her days, Miss Dinsmore? Asked Mrs. Murray when Adelaide told her this. No, was the smiling rejoinder. I know he would be very loath to resign her, but this is Elsie's own doing. She says the man for whom she would be willing to give up her native land must be very dear indeed, that her hand shall never be given without her heart, and that it still belongs to her father than to anyone else. Ah, that is well, Miss Adelaide. I have been sorely troubled about my sweet Ban. I never breathed a thought to either mortal ear, but when they came hame frae that summer in the north, she was na the blithe young thing she had been. And there was that in the wistful and hungered look of her sweet ain, when she turned them whiles upon her father, that made me think some men he did not approve had won the innocent young heart. Oh, well, Mrs. Murray, whatever may have been amiss then is all over now. My sister writes me that Elsie seems very happy, and as devotedly attached to her father as ever, insisting that no one ever can be so dear to her as he. Mrs. Dinsmore's last letter was dated Naples, and there they still lingered. One bright spring day they were out sightseeing, and I wandered into a picture gallery which they had visited once or twice before. Rose had her husband's arm. Elsie held her little brother's hand in hers. "Sister," said the child, "look at those ladies and gentlemen. They are English, aren't they?" "Yes, I think so," Elsie answered, following the direction of his glance. "A party of English tourists. No, one of the gentlemen looks like an American." "That one nearest this way? I can only see his side face, but I think he is the handsomest. Don't you?" "Yes, and he has a fine form too, an easy, graceful carriage, and polished manners," she added, as at that moment he stooped to pick up a handkerchief dropped by one of the ladies of his party, and presented it to its owner. Elsie was partial to her own countrymen, and unaccountably to herself felt an unusual interest in this one. She watched him furtively, wondering who he was, and thinking that in appearance and manners he compared very favorably with the counts, lords, and dukes who in the past 2 years had so frequently hovered about her and hung upon her smiles. But her father called her attention to something in the painting he and Rose were examining, and when she turned to look again for the stranger and his companions, she perceived that they were gone. "Papa," she asked, "did you notice that party of tourists?" "Not particularly. What about them?" "I am quite certain that one of the gentlemen was an American, and I half fancied that there was something familiar in his air and manner." "Ah, I wish you had spoken of it while he was here, that I might have made sure whether he were an old acquaintance. But come," he added, taking out his watch, "it is time for us to return home." The Dinsmores were occupying an old palace, the property of a noble family whose decayed fortunes compelled the renting of their ancestral home. In the afternoon of the day of their visit to the picture gallery, Mr. Dinsmore and his daughter were seated in his spacious saloon, she beside a window overlooking the street, he at a little distance from her, and near to a table covered with books, magazines, and newspapers. That day I brought him a heavy mail from America, and he was examining the New York and Philadelphia dailies with keen interest. Elsie was evidently paying no heed to what might be passing in the street. A bit of fancy work gave employment to her fingers, while her thoughts were busy with the contents of a letter received from my Aunt Adelaide that morning. It brought ill news. Arthur had been seriously injured by a railroad accident, and, it was feared, was crippled for life. But that was not all. Dick Percival, whom Enna had married nearly 2 years before, had now become utterly bankrupt, having wasted his patrimony on rioting and drunkenness, losing large sums at the gaming table, and his young wife, left homeless and destitute, having been compelled to return to her father's house with her infant son. Mr. Dinsmore uttered a slight exclamation. "What is it, papa?" asked Elsie, lifting her eyes to meet his fixed upon her with an expression of mingled gratitude and tenderness. "Come here," he said, and as she obeyed he drew her to his knee, passing his arm about her waist, and, holding the paper before her, pointed to a short paragraph which had just caught his eye. She read it at a glance. Her face flushed, then paled. She put her arm about his neck and laid her cheek to his, while tears trembled in the soft eyes, as soft and beautiful as ever. For a moment neither spoke, then she murmured in low, quivering tones the same words that had fallen from her lips 2 years ago. "Thank God for a father's protecting love and care." "Thank him that I have my daughter safe in my arms," he said, tightening his clasp about her slender waist. "Ah, my own precious child, how could I ever have borne to see you sacrificed to that wretch?" They had just learned that Tom Jackson had been tried for manslaughter and for forgery, found guilty on both charges, and sentenced to the state prison for a long term of years. They were quiet again for a little. Then Elsie said, "Papa, I want to ask you something." "Well, daughter, say on." "I have been thinking how sad it must be for poor Enna to find herself so destitute, and that I should like to settle something upon her, say $10,000 or $20,000, if I may." "My dear child," he said with a smile, "I have no control over you now as regards the disposal of your property. Do you forget that you passed your majority 3 weeks ago?" "No, papa, I have not forgotten, but I don't mean ever to do anything of importance without your approval. So please make up your mind that I am always to be your own little girl, never more than 18 or 22. Now won't you answer my question about Enna?" "I think it would be quite as well, or better, to defer any such action for the present. It won't hurt Enna to be made to feel poor and dependent for a time. She needs a lesson, and her parents will not allow her to suffer privation of any sort. Ah, here comes Mamma in walking attire. We are going out for perhaps an hour, leaving house, servants, and the little ones in your charge. Horace, be careful to do just as your sister tells you." "Yes, papa, I will," answered the child, who had come in with his mother, and had a book in his hand. "Will you help me with my lesson, Elsie, and hear me say it when it is learned?" "Yes, that I will. Here's a stool for you close by my side," she said, going back to her seat by the window. "Goodbye, dears. We won't be gone long," said Rose, taking her husband's arm. Elsie and Horace watched them till they had passed out of sight far down the street, then returned to their employments, her thoughts now going back, not to Roselands, but to Lansdale, Ashlands, and Philadelphia. Memory and imagination bringing vividly before her each scene of her past life in which Edgerton had borne a part. Did any of the old love come back? No, for he was not the same man who had won her esteem and affection, and even while sending up a silent petition for his final conversion, she shuddered at the thought of her past danger, and was filled with gratitude to God and her father at the remembrance of her narrow escape. Her brother's voice recalled her from her musings. "Look, sister," he exclaimed, glancing from the window. "There is the very same gentleman we saw this morning, and see, he's crossing the street. I do believe he's coming here." Elsie looked, recognized the stranger, and perceived, with a slight emotion of surprise and pleasure, that he was approaching their door. That he was her countryman, and perhaps direct from her dear native lands, was sufficient to make him a welcome visitor. The next moment John threw open the door of the saloon, and announced, "A gentleman from America." "One who brings no letter of introduction, yet hopes for an audience of you, fair lady," he said, coming forward with smiling countenance and outstretched hand. "Mr. Travilla! Can it be possible?" she cried, starting up in joyful astonishment and hastening to bid him welcome. "You are not sorry to see me, then, my little friend?" he said, taking her offered hand and pressing it in both of his. "Sorry, my dear sir! What a question! Were you not always a most welcome guest in my father's house? And if welcome at home, much more so here in a foreign land." Mr. Travilla looked into the sweet face, more beautiful than ever, and longed to treat her with the affectionate freedom of former days, yet refrained, the gentle dignity of her manner seeming to forbid it, pleased and cordial as was her greeting. He turned to Horace and shook hands with him, remarking that he had grown very much. "I am very glad to see you, sir," said the boy. "You have not forgotten me, then?" "Ah, no, indeed. And I can't think how it was that sister and I did not know you yesterday in the picture gallery, though we knew you were an American." "Ah, were you there? How blind I must have been!" And he turned to Elsie again. "We were there for but a few minutes before your party left, and quite at the other end of that long gallery," she said. "But I am surprised that I failed to recognize you, even at that distance. But I had no thought of your being in the country. How delighted Papa will be to see you! He has often spoken of the old times when you and he traveled over Europe together, and wished that you were with him on this trip. He and Mamma have gone out, but will be in presently." Elsie had many inquiries to make in regard to the health and welfare of relatives and friends, and the old family servants at the Oaks. Mr. Travilla had numerous questions to ask concerning all that she had seen and done since leaving America. But in the midst of it all she exclaimed, "Ah, you must see our little Frenchwoman! Such a darling as she is!" "I'll ring the bell, sister," said Horace, seeing her glance toward it. John appeared in answer, was ordered to tell the nurse to bring the baby, and a neatly dressed middle-aged woman presently entered the room, carrying a lovely infant a little more than a year old. "See, is she not a darling?" said Elsie, taking it in her arms. "She has Mamma's own sweet pretty blue eyes, and is named for her. Our Rosebud, we call her. Papa gave her the name, and he says she is as much like her mother as I am like mine. You don't know, Mr. Travilla, how glad I was when she came to us. It was something so new and delightful to have a sister of my own. Ah, I love her dearly, and she returns my affection. There, see her lay her little head down on my shoulder." Mr. Travilla admired and caressed the little creature, coaxed her to come to him for a moment, and the nurse carried her away. "When do you return home, Elsie?" he asked. "In the fall. Mr. and Mrs. Ferris, Mamma's grandparents, had their golden wedding in October. Sophie expects to be married at the same time, and of course we wish to be present on the occasion. We have yet to visit Turin, Venice, and Munich. After seeing these places we intend to spend the rest of the summer in Switzerland, sailing for America sometime in September. Ah, here are Papa and Mamma," she added, as the two entered the room together. "Travilla, what favorable wind blew you here?" cried Mr. Dinsmore, shaking his friend's hand in almost boyish delight. "A westerly one, I believe," answered Travilla, laughing and shaking hands with Rose, who looked scarcely less pleased than her husband. They think at Roselands and the Oaks that your year is a very long one, or that you have lost your reckoning, and were anxious to send a messenger to assist you in recovering it. So I volunteer my services." "Ah, that was kind. But to be able to do so to our advantage, you will need to take up your abode with us for the present, and to make one of our party when we start again upon our travels." "Of course you will," added Rose. "We always consider you one of the family, a sort of brother to us and uncle to the children." "Thank you, you are most kind," he said, with a slight flush suffusing his cheek for an instant, while his eyes involuntarily sought Elsie's face with a wistful, longing look. Her father turned laughingly to her. "Is this your stranger of the picture gallery? Ah, are you not ashamed of failing to recognize so old a friend?" "Yes, papa, but I did not catch sight of his full face, and he was at quite a distance, and I never thinking of the possibility that he could be anywhere out of America. And time makes changes in us all. It's fast turning me into a quiet, middle-aged man." "You are very kind to furnish another excuse for my stupidity," said Elsie, smiling, "but I really cannot see that you have changed in the least since I saw you last." "And no stranger would ever think of pronouncing you over 30, added Rose. "Ah, you flatter me, fair ladies," returned Mr. Travilla, smiling and shaking his head. "No, I can vouch for the truthfulness and honesty of both," said Mr. Dinsmore. Mr. Travilla did not hesitate to accept his friend's invitation, knowing that it was honestly given, and feeling that he could not decline it without doing violence to his own inclination. He made one of their party during the rest of their stay in Europe and on the voyage to America. His presence was most welcome to all. He saw no reason to doubt that, and yet Elsie's manner sometimes saddened and depressed him. Not that there was ever in it anything approaching to coolness, but it lacked the old delightful familiarity, instead of which there was now a quiet reserve, a gentle dignity, that kept him at a distance, and while increasing his admiration for the fair girl, bade him sigh for the old childish days when she was scarcely into more constraint with him than with her father. Our little party reached Philadelphia a fortnight before the golden wedding. They found the handsome city residence of the Allisons occupied by the family, and full of the pleasant stir and bustle of preparation for the eventful day which was to witness the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the wedding of Mr. and Mrs. Ferris, and the marriage of their granddaughter. Sophie, while paying a visit to Rose in her southern home, had won the heart of Harry Carrington, and they had been engaged a year or more. Harry had once indulged a secret penchant for Elsie, but now he would not have exchanged his merry, blue-eyed Sophie for her, or for any other lady in the land. The young couple were married at church, very early in the evening, Elsie acting as first bridesmaid. Returning to the house, the bridal party were ushered into the drawing room, which they found richly ornamented with evergreens and flowers. In the center rose a pyramid of rare and beautiful blossoms, filling the air with their delicious perfume. Above that was a wide arch of evergreens bearing the monogram of Mr. and Mrs. Ferris, placed between the dates of their marriage and of this anniversary. The old bride and groom sat together beneath the arch on one side of the pyramid, while the newly married pair took up a similar position upon the other. Only the family and near connections were present for the first half hour. The eldest son of Mr. and Mrs. Ferris made a short address, thanking his aged parents for their unselfish love and devotion to their offspring, and exhorting the youthful bride and groom to follow in their footsteps. Upon the conclusion of this little speech, gifts were presented by children and grandchildren, and letters of congratulation in both poetry and prose from absent friends were read. After this, the doors were thrown open to the invited guests, and for the remainder of the evening the house was thronged with the elite of the city, and with friends and acquaintances from other parts of the country. Among the latter were Adelaide and Walter Dinsmore, and Mr. Travilla and his mother. The last named were seated in the corner of a sofa, her son standing by her side. He heard a low-breathed sigh, noted the quivering of her lip and the gathering tears in the gentle eyes, as she turned them upon the gray-haired bride and groom, and he knew that her thoughts were with the early dead, the husband and father whose image he could scarcely recall. His heart swelled with tender pitying, protecting love, as he thought of her long, lonely widowhood, and of all that she had been and still was to him. But her gaze wandered to the pair standing just upon the threshold of married life, and smiling up at him. "They are a handsome couple," she said. "How proud and happy Harry looks! Ah, Edward, when will your turn come?" He shook his head with a rather melancholy smile. "It is your own fault, I am sure," she continued in a playful tone. There are plenty of pretty girls and charming young widows who would like well to be mistress of Ion. And I am growing old, and sometimes feel that I would be glad to resign the scepter to younger hands." He gave her a glance of affectionate concern. "I shall look for a housekeeper immediately. I ought to have thought of it before." "No, no, it is a daughter I want," she returned still playfully. "I have often wondered how it has come to pass that my warm-hearted boys seem so perfectly invulnerable to Cupid's darts." "All seeming, mother," he answered lightly, but with a wistful yearning look in his eyes which were fixed upon a little group on the farther side of the room. "To tell you a secret," and he bent down, that the low-breathed words might catch her ear alone, "I have been hopelessly in love for many years." She started with surprise, for there was the ring of deep, earnest feeling beneath the jesting tone. Then, following the direction of his glance, and perceiving that the group upon which it rested was composed of Adelaide and Elsie Dinsmore, with some half-dozen gentlemen who had gathered about them, she looked greatly pleased. "And why hopeless?" she asked. "Ah, the evidences of indifference are so patent that I cannot hope that she will ever learn to care for me." "And pray what may they be?" "Constraint and reserve, where formerly there was much warmth and cordiality of manner." "You foolish boy! If that be all, you may take heart. I would not ask for better symptoms. And remember the old proverb, 'Faint heart never won fair lady.' You do not fear that she still clings to the old love?" "No, ah, no!" "I never saw Adelaide look better than she does tonight," was Mrs. Travilla's next remark. "What a queenly presence and noble face she has, and how very lovely our little Elsie is. She seems to have gained every womanly grace without losing a particle of her sweet childish simplicity and freshness." Her son assented with a slight sigh, and wandered off in their direction. But before he reached the little group, Elsie had taken Harold Allison's arm and was being led away toward the conservatory. Harold had a rare plant to show her, and was glad of the excuse to get her to himself for a few moments. For the rest of the evening Mr. Travilla devoted himself to Adelaide, his mother looking on with beaming countenance, and thinking how gladly she would welcome the dear girl to her heart and home. It was past 12 when the company dispersed, Harry and his bride having started an hour before upon their wedding tour. "Get to bed as soon as you can, my dear child. You are looking sadly fatigued," Mrs. Dinsmore said, putting his arm about his daughter as she came to him for a good night kiss. "I will, papa," she answered, clinging to him with more than her usual warmth of affection. "Dear papa, what could I ever do without you to love me?" "My darling, if it please the Lord, may we be long spared to each other," he whispered, clasping her close. "Now, good night, and may He bless you, and keep you, and ever cause His face to shine upon you." Elsie turned away with eyes full of tears, and her pillow was bedewed with them ere she slept that night. But the morning found her apparently her own bright, sunny self again. She was in her mamma's dressing room soon after breakfast, chatting with her and Adelaide, Mr. Dinsmore sitting by with Rosebud on his knee. Of course they were discussing the wedding, how lovely the bride and her attendants looked, how handsome the groom, how tasteful and becoming was the dress of this lady and that, how attentive was Mr. Such-a-one to Miss So-and-so, etc., Rose making a little jesting allusion to the devotion of a certain gentleman to Adelaide, and saying how pleased she was. Nothing could please her better than for them to fancy each other, and when in the midst of it all, a servant came up with a message. Mr. Travilla was in the drawing room asking for Miss Dinsmore, Miss Adelaide. She went down at once, and as the door closed upon her, Rose turned to her husband with the laughing remark, "It would be a splendid match. They seem just made for each other. I wonder they didn't find it out long ago, and I began to quite set my heart upon it." "Better not, my dear, lest they disappoint you, and allow me to advise you to let matchmaking alone. 'Tis a dangerous business." "Elsie, my child, you are looking pale this morning. Late hours do not agree with you. I think I shall have to take to sending you to bed at 9 o'clock again when once I get you home." "Won't 10 be early enough, papa?" she answered with a faint smile, a vivid color suddenly suffusing her cheek. "Well, we will see about it, but I can't have you looking so. Go and put on your hat and shawl, and I will take you or mamma out for an airing." "Looking so?" said Rose, with an arch glance at the glowing cheeks, as she stooped to take Rosebud in her arms. "She is not pale now." "No, certainly not," he said. "Come back, daughter," for Elsie had risen to obey his order, and was moving toward the door. "Come here and tell me what ails you." "I am quite well, papa, "Only a little tired from last night, I believe," she answered as he took her hands in his and looked searchingly into her face. "I hope that is all," he said a little anxiously. "You must lie down and try to get a nap when we return from our drive, and remember you must be in bed by 10 o'clock tonight." "I shall do just as my father bids me," she said, smiling up at him. "My dear father who is so kindly careful of me." Then, as he let go her hand, she tripped lightly from the room. Mr. Travilla had come on an errand from his mother. She begged Adelaide's advice and assistance in a little shopping. Adelaide was at leisure, and at once donned bonnet and shawl and went with him to the Girlhood house, where the old lady awaited their coming, and the three spent the remainder of the morning in attending to Mr. Travilla's purchases and visiting the Academy of Fine Arts. In driving down Chestnut Street, the Dinsmores passed them on their way to the Academy. Adelaide did not return to Mr. Allison's to dinner, but Mr. Travilla called presently after to say that she had dined with his mother and himself at the hotel, and would not return until bedtime, as they were all going to hear a Go lecture that evening. He was speaking to Mrs. Allison. Several of the family were in the room, Elsie among them. She was slipping quietly away when he turned to her, saying, "Would you not like to go with us, my little friend? I think you would find it entertaining, and we would be glad to have you." "Thank you, sir, you are very kind, but a prior engagement compels me to decline," she answered, glancing smilingly at her father. "She has not been looking well today, and I have ordered her to go to bed early tonight," Mrs. Dinsmore said. "Ah, that is right," murmured Mr. Travilla, rising to take leave. The Travillas stayed a week longer in the city. During that time Adelaide went out with them quite frequently, but Elsie saw scarcely anything of her old friend, which was, however, all her own fault, as she studiously avoided him, much to his grief and disturbance. He could not imagine what he had done to so completely estrange her from him. Mrs. Dinsmore felt in some haste to be at home again, but Mrs. Allison pleaded so hard for another week that he consented to delay. Adelaide and Walter went with the Travillas, and wanted to take Elsie with them, but he would not hear of such an arrangement, while she said very decidedly that she could not think of being separated from her father. She seemed gay and happy when with the family, or alone with him or Rose. But coming upon her unexpectedly in her dressing room, the day after the others had left, he found her in tears. "Why, my darling, what can be the matter?" he asked, taking her in his arms. "Nothing, papa," she said, hastily wiping away her tears and hiding her blushing face on his breast. I believe I'm a little homesick." "Ah, then, why did you not ask to go with the others?" "And leave you? Ah, do you not know that my father is a great deal more than half of home to me?" she answered, hugging him close. "And you wouldn't have let me go?" "No, indeed, not I. But I am afraid I really ought to read you a lecture. I dare say you miss Sophie very much, but still there are young people enough left in the house to keep you from feeling very dull and lonely, I should think. And as you have all your dear ones about you, and expect to go home in a few days, I ought to be cheerful and happy. I know it, papa," she said, as she paused, leaving his sentence unfinished, "and I am afraid I am very wicked and ungrateful. But please don't be vexed with me, and I will try to banish this feeling of depression." "I fear you are not well," he said, turning her face to the light and examining it with keen scrutiny. "Tell me, are you ill?" "No, papa, I think not. Don't be troubled about me." "I shall send for a doctor if this depression lasts," he said decidedly, "for I shall have to conclude that it must arise from some physical cause, since I know of no other, and it is so foreign to the nature of my sunny-tempered little girl." He saw no more of it, though he watched her carefully. Great was the rejoicing at the Oaks when at last the family returned. Adelaide was there to welcome them, and Elsie thought that she had never seen her look so youthful, pretty, and happy. Chloe remarked upon it while preparing her young mistress for bed, adding that the report in the kitchen was that Miss Adelaide and Mr. Travilla were engaged, and would probably marry very soon. Elsie made no remark, but her heart seemed to sink like lead into her bosom. "Why am I grieving so? What is there in this news to make me sorry?" she asked herself as she wetted her pillow with her tears. "I'm sure I'm very glad that dear Aunt Addie is so happy, and I used often to wish he was my uncle." Yet the tears would not cease their flow till she had wept herself to sleep. But she seemed bright and gay as usual in the morning, and meeting her parents at the breakfast table, thought they looked as though something had pleased them greatly. It was Rose who told her the news, as an hour later they sauntered about the garden together, noting the changes which had taken place there in their absence. "I have something to tell you, dear," Rose said, and Elsie shivered slightly, knowing what was coming. Something that pleases your father and me very much, and I think it will make you glad too. Can you guess what it is?" "About Aunt Adelaide, Mamma?" Elsie stooped over a plant, thus concealing her face from view, and so controlled her voice that it betrayed no emotion. "Yes, I know. She is engaged." "And you are pleased with the match?" "Of course. I knew you would be. You used so often to wish that he was your uncle, and now he soon will be. Your papa and I are delighted. We think there could not have been a more suitable match for either." "I'm very glad for her, dear Aunt Addie, and for him, too," Elsie said, her voice growing a little husky at the last. But Rose was speaking to the gardener and did not notice it, and Elsie wandered on. Presently turned into the path leading to her arbor, and seeking its welcome privacy, there relieved her full heart by a flood of tears. Mr. Travilla called that day, but saw nothing of his little friend, and in consequence went away very sorrowful, and pondering deeply the question what he could have done so to alienate her affection so entirely from him. The next day he came again, quite resolved to learn in what he had offended, and was overjoyed at hearing that she was alone in her favorite arbor. He saw her there and found her in tears. She hastily wiped them away on perceiving his approach, but could not remove their traces. "Good morning," she said, rising and giving him her hand, but with a reserved manner that had now become habitual, instead of the pleasant ease and familiarity of the earlier days. "Were you looking for papa? I think he is somewhere on the plantation." "No, my dear child, it was you I wished to see." "Me, Mr. Travilla?" And she cast down her eyes, while her cheek crimsoned, for he was looking straight into them with his, so wistful and tender, so full of earnest, questioning, sorrowful entreaty, that she knew not how to meet their gaze. "Yes, you, my little friend, for I cannot longer endure this torturing anxiety. Will you not tell me, dear child, what I have done to hurt or grieve you so?" I am not hurt or grieve. You have always been most kind," she stammered, but why should you think I was—" The rest of the sentence was lost in a burst of tears, and covering her burning cheeks with her hands, she sank down upon the seat from which she had risen to greet him. "My dear child, I did not mean to pain you so. Do not weep, it breaks my heart to see it. I was far from intending to blame you, or complain of your treatment," he said in an agitated tone, and bending over her in tender concern. "I only wanted to understand my error in order that I might retrieve it, and be no longer deprived of your dear society. Oh, little Elsie, if you only knew how I love you, how I have loved you, and only you, all these years, as child and as woman. How I have waited and longed, hoping even against hope, that some day I might be able to win the priceless treasure of your young heart." Intense, glad surprise made her drop her hands and look up at him. "But are you not, I thought, I understood, Aunt Adelaide?" "Your Aunt Adelaide!" he cried, scarcely less astonished than herself. "Can it be that you do not know, that you have not heard of her engagement to Edward Ellison?" A light broke upon Elsie at that question, and her face grew radiant with happiness. There was one flash of exceeding joy in the soft eyes that met his, and then they sought the ground. "Oh, my darling, could you? Can it be?" He took her in his arms, folded her close to his heart, calling her by every tender and endearing name, and she made no effort to escape, or to avoid his caresses, did nothing but hide her blushing face on his breast, and weep tears of deep joy and thankfulness. It might have been half an hour or an hour afterward, they reckoned nothing of the flight of time, that Mr. Dinsmore, coming in search of his daughter, found them seated side by side, Mr. Travilla with his arm about Elsie's waist and her hand in his. So absorbed were they in each other that they had not heard the approaching footsteps. It was a state of affairs Mr. Dinsmore was far from expecting, and pausing upon the threshold he stood spellbound with astonishment. "Elsie!" he said at length. Both started and looked up at the sound of his voice, and Mr. Travilla, still holding fast to his new-found treasure, said in tones tremulous with joy, "Will you give her to me, Dinsmore? She is willing now." "Ah, is it so, Elsie, my darling?" faltered the father, opening his arms to receive her as she flew to him. "Is it so? Have I lost the first place in my daughter's heart?" he repeated, straining her to his breast, and pressing his lips again and again to her fair brow. "Dear papa, I never loved you better," she murmured, clinging more closely to him. "I shall never cease to be your own dear daughter, can never have any father but you, my own dear, dear papa, and you will not be left without a little girl to pet and fondle. Darling Rosebud will fill my place. She has her own, but neither she nor anyone else can ever fill yours, my darling," he answered with a quivering lip. How can I? How can I give you up? My firstborn, my Elsie child and mine. You'll give her to me, my friend? Repeated Travilla. I'll cherish her as the apple of my eye. I shall never take her away from you. You may see her every day. You love her tenderly, but she is dearer to me than my own soul. If you have won her heart, I could not refuse you her hand. Say, Elsie, my daughter, is it so? Yes, papa, she whispered, turning her blushing face away from his keen, searching gaze. I can hardly bear to do it. My precious one, I don't know how to resign you to another, he said in a voice low and tremulous with emotion, and holding her close to his heart. But since it is your wish, I must. Take her, my friend, she is yours, but God do so to you, and more also, if ever you show her aught but love and tenderness. He put her hand into Travilla's and turned to go, but she clung to him with the other. Yours too, papa, she said, looking up into his sad face with eyes that were full of tears. Always your own daughter who loves you better than life. Yes, darling, and who has as dearly loved in return, he said, stooping to press another kiss on the ruby lips. Let us be happy, for we are not to part. Then walking quickly away, he left them alone together. End of chapter 23. Recording by GabrielleC. End of Elsie's Girlhood by Martha Finley.